Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Voluntarist Academy. I'm James Cordiner, and if you're here, I want to thank you for your listenership and your support. Tonight, we'll get right into it. If I sound a little under the weather, it's because I am. Voluntaristacademy.com is the website. Please check that out. All the resources that you need, everything that I have on this channel, you can find. You can find PDF versions of everything on the website. You can take those and, do some of your own research, look at the footnotes, look at the indexes of those books, dig a little deeper than what you see here. So tonight we're going to be reading a little bit of an excerpt from David Osterfeld book called The Freedom, Society, and the State, an investigation into the possibility of society without government. I first heard of this from this book, Anarchy and the Law, The Political Economy of Choice, edited by Edward P. Stringham. This book is like an aggregation of different essays and excerpts from different books, just kind of thrown together to like kind of talk about, anarchist philosophy and everything. It's a pretty thick book. It's pretty big, but it's also pretty cheap. It was published in 2007, and there's a lot of interesting cats in this book. I like the index. I like going to the index because, the front here. I like going to the front here to find the contents of the book, and next thing you know, I'm off to the races, and I can kind of just like, find what I want to read. And I found this, so we're gonna jump right over to that, and here we go. Oh yeah, by the way, Brendan Daniel, of course, intro music by Brendan Daniel, and go check him out on Instagram. So here we go. David Osterfeld, Freedom, Society, and the State, an investigation into the possibility of society without government. This is just an excerpt. A political and economic overview. So as we go through this, I just want to let people know it's broken down after this overview. It's broken down into 3 parts. I have a graph that I'll be pulling up, and we'll be kind of going through the graph. So I've come prepared this evening, just so that everybody know. 3 parts plus an overview, 30 pages. It's gonna be a breeze. And this is just generally an account from David Osterfeld of the evolution of anarchist philosophy and the different brands of anarchism out there, and an account of that. Then I felt like it was necessary to bring this to you guys because it could help stimulate the conversation and kind of show, what can be done. So let's get started. Freedom, Society, and the State, an investigation into the possibility of society without government, an excerpt out of a book written by David Osterfeld back in like 1986. A political and economic overview. Libertarianism is a politico-economic philosophy of individualism. It is premised on the belief that every individual has an unalienable right to live his own life as he sees fit, provided he does not aggress against the equal rights of others. There are 2 distinct strains of libertarian thought: minarchism and anarchism. While this study focuses on the anarchist branch of libertarianism, the sole, although crucial, difference between the 2 factions resides in their views regarding government provision of police and proper function of court services. The minarchist believes that the only proper function of government is to protect individuals from aggression. Consequently, they argue for a quote-unquote night watchman state to operate solely in this area, and believe that all of the other services currently supplied by government can be handled on the market. The anarchists, however, go even further and believe that government can be dispensed with entirely, and that even police and court functions can be supplied better and at less risk of tyranny on the market. Because the anarchists' propose that a definite economic institution, the market, replace the political institution of government, they have been referred to as free market anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, and individualist anarchists. Since libertarianism is compatible with any voluntary, non-coercive, institutional arrangement of which the market is only one, albeit the most significant, of such arrangements, terms such as free market anarchism or anarcho-capitalism are overly restrictive. The term individualist anarchists will therefore be the term normally used to refer to those who oppose government entirely and advocate the market as the primary, in fact indispensable, mechanism for the voluntary coordination of social activity. It should be pointed out in this context that a synthesis of anarchism and capitalism was regarded as impossible by traditional proponents of both doctrines. While the defenders of capitalism, such as the classical liberals of the 19th century, believed that government should be kept strictly limited and as much as possible handled by the market, it should not be thought that they allied themselves with anarchism. On the contrary, it would not be too strong to describe classical liberalism's attitude toward anarchism as one of both contempt as well as fear. It was contemptuous because, as one classical liberal philosopher wrote, anarchism, quote, would be practicable only in a world of angels, end quote, and the, quote, liberal understands quite clearly, end quote, that one must be in a position to compel the person who will not respect lives, health, personal feelings, or private property of others to acquiesce in the rules of society. And classical liberalism had feared anarchism because, while encompassing a broad spectrum of thought ranging from the rampant individualism of Max Stirner to the communism of Peter Kropotkin, the dominant strain of anarchism ostensibly placed it squarely within the socialist camp. Daniel Guerin put the matter succinctly. Anarchism, he says, quote, is really a synonym for socialism, end quote. And while acknowledging, quote, Stirner's complete rejection of all political, moral, and traditional ties of the individual, end quote, Max Adler goes so far as to argue that Stirner cannot even be considered an anarchist since anarchism is only, quote, a definite political trend within the socialist labor movement, end quote. And Stirner was not a socialist. Hence, not just the state, but the capitalist economic system were the principal evils for the majority of anarchist thinkers of the 19th century. It was not accidental that in Kropotkin's delineation of the three cardinal aims of anarchist communism, the first was an injunction against capitalism. Quote, emancipation from the yoke of capital, production in common and free consumption of all the products of common labor, end quote. Only after his exhortation to abolish capitalism does one find a call for, quote, emancipation from the government, end quote, and emancipation from religion, end quote. The views of the Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta and the Britisher William Morris were similar. Both equated anarchism with communism and called for the free distribution of all goods. Bakunin, while a collectivist rather than a communist, also advocated the liberation from capitalism. Even in the writings of the more individualist-oriented anarchists, one finds condemnation of capitalism coupled with panegyrics to socialism. In a striking phrase, Proudhon not only declared that, quote, property is theft, end quote, but also exclaimed, quote, what is the capitalist? Everything. What should he be? Nothing, end quote. Similarly, the English anarchist William Godwin asserted that, quote, it follows upon the principles of equal and impartial justice that the good things of the world are a common stock, upon which one man has a title as another to draw for what he wants, end quote. And the American anarchist Benjamin Tucker contended that there were, quote, two schools of socialistic thought, end quote. The state socialism of Karl Marx and the anarchism of Proudhon and the American Josiah Warren. Tucker placed himself in the anarcho-socialist camp. Thus, it is not surprising that anarchism was abhorrent to the classical liberals. Quote-unquote liberalism, wrote Ludwig von Mises, quote, is not anarchism, nor has it anything to do with anarchism, end quote. In the 20th century, followers of classical liberalism, the minarchists, have followed their mentors in rejecting anarchism. But while a quick glance at the major anarchist thinkers of Europe, England, and America would ostensibly indicate that all were firmly anti-capitalistic, a closer look will show you that this is incorrect. For the term capitalism has been used in socialist literature in two contradictory manners. On the one hand, the term is used to denote production according to the dictates of the market, or in socialist terminology, quote-unquote commodity production. On the other, capitalism is defined in terms of class relations, i.e., the ownership of the means of production by the bourgeois or ruling class. The former may be termed the economic definition, and the latter the sociological definition. If the economic definition is used, it follows that the more things are handled by the market, the more capitalistic the society. This means that price controls, tariffs, licensing restrictions, state unemployment compensation, state poor relief, etc., whether they are considered beneficial or not, must be classified as anti-capitalistic institutions since they constitute modifications or restrictions of the market. Since the state does not sell its services on the market, quote-unquote state capitalism, according to the economic definition, is a contradiction in terms. But if the sociological definition is used, the state becomes compatible with capitalism. For whatever serves to entrench the bourgeois class, the owners of the means of production in power is, ipso facto, quote-unquote capitalistic. Since both proponents and critics of capitalism were in general agreement that market competition would force the quote-unquote rate of profit to fall, the two definitions lead to mutually exclusive consequences. Why did I say that weird? Since the economic or market definition posits pure laissez-faire, any government intervention to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie is anathema. But that is precisely what is entailed in the sociological definition. The state intervention to protect profits and institutionalize the position of the property-owning class. When the sociological definition is used, capitalism becomes incomprehensible without control of the state by the bourgeoisie. For with the power of the state behind them, the bourgeoisie are able to protect their privileged positions from the threat of competition by the establishment of tariff barriers, licensing restrictions, and other statist measures. The proponents of capitalism, however, had only the economic definition in mind when they defended capitalism. Far from intending to defend state intervention to preserve artificially high profits, it was, in fact, such pro-capitalist writers as Adam Smith who vehemently condemned such quote-unquote mercantilist arrangements and urged their replacement by free trade capitalism. Since comparison can only be made when definitions tap the same domain, confusion occurred because of these definitional differences, and critics and opponents of capitalism talked past each other when many were in basic agreement. But if the economic spectrum is analyzed from the point of view of the economic definitions only, then comparison can be made on the following basis. Capitalism would be equated with the market, communism with the absence of the market, and mercantilism with a mixed or restricted market. Okay, for those of you watching, note this little graph, this like timeline graph type thing. 0 from 100, 0 being communism, smack in the middle is mercantilism, and 100 being capitalism. Moving on. We are now in a position to reassess the anti-capitalism of the anarchists. What is evident in such a taxonomy is that while certain anarchists, such as Kropotkin and Bakunin, must certainly be classified as socialist or communist, others like Proudhon, Godwin, and especially the Native American anarchists, such as Josiah Warren, Benjamin Tucker, and Victor Yaros, despite their characterization of themselves as socialists, must be placed within the capitalist camp. A closer look at the anarchists themselves will make this clear. All right, so like I said in the beginning, here we go. Here's section 1. A, anarcho-communism. This is when we're going to be getting into the different types of anarchism, according to this dude. So it's interesting. Let's see what he has to say. A, anarcho-communism. At one end of the anarchist spectrum, we find those who, like Kropotkin and his followers, blend anarchism and communism. The anarcho-communists oppose exchange, money, the division of labor, private property, and the wage system. Capitalism, they argue, is just as quote-unquote barbarous as feudalism, only the forms have changed. Quote, the worker is forced under the name of free contract, says Kropotkin, to accept feudal obligations for a turn where he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger. End quote. Since the capitalist owns the means of production, he can dictate wage rates. This puts the worker at a distinct disadvantage. The wage system, therefore, reduces the worker to poverty. On the other hand, despite the advance in technology, which has made a life of abundance possible for all, quote, the owners of capital constantly reduce the output by restricting production, end quote, thereby keeping prices high. Labor is further squandered by the production of luxuries for the capitalist class, as well as by the money spent on armaments, salaries for judges, prison guards, policemen, etc. All money spent by government is useless, says Kropotkin, since there is a definite relationship between crime and poverty. Hence, if one eliminates capitalism, poverty and thus crime would nearly disappear, and government would become unnecessary. Social behavior would be regulated by voluntary compliance to quote-unquote unwritten customs. As Kropotkin's biographer, Martin Miller, put it, quote, the tradition of authority was to be replaced by the authority of tradition, end quote. As for the, quote, few antisocial acts that may still take place, says Kropotkin, the best remedy will consist in loving treatment, moral influence, and liberty, end quote. And if that doesn't work, then the aggressor can, quote, of course be expelled from fellowship, end quote. Private property, whether that of capitalism or mercantilism, is likewise condemned. Since everything material as well as mental is a product of the contributions of countless individuals, past as well as present, it is impossible to determine the actual contributions of each. Consequently, argues Kropotkin, property cannot rightfully be private, but only common. All have a right to an equal share of all that is produced, but not only the means of production, but also the product of production, including houses, clothing, and food, is to be communalized. The first principle of anarcho-communism, says Kropotkin, is that, quote, the means of production being the collective work of humanity, the product should be the collective property of the race, end quote. Since collectivism only wishes to collectivize the means of production while retaining individual ownership of its product, Kropotkin condemns it as simply a modification rather than a quote-unquote negation of wage slavery. In the absence of the state, the cities will automatically transform themselves into quote-unquote communistic communes, end quote. These communes will be large enough to be nearly or completely self-sufficient, and at one point, Kropotkin says that each commune would be populated by, quote, a few millions of inhabitants. Man, he further argues, is not naturally lazy. It is the private ownership system that, quote, unquote, places a premium on idleness. But since under communism everyone would know that their subsistence is secured for them, quote, they would not ask nothing better than to work at their old trades, end quote. In fact, he says the voluntary work of the new society, he says, quote, will be infinitely superior and yield far more than work has produced up to now under the goal of slavery, serfdom, and wagedom. end quote. Kropotkin envisions the anarcho-communist society to be so productive, in fact, that he claims that each individual would only have to work 5 hours per day, and that only between the ages of 20 or 22 to 45 or 50. In short, for the anarcho-communist, not only private property, whether capitalist or mercantilist, but the entire market as well, has to all be abolished. The capitalist system is to be replaced by, quote, fee communism, end quote, which, quote, places the production reaped or manufactured in common at the disposal of all, leaving to each the liberty to consume as he pleases, end quote. All right, next is B, anarcho-collectivism. Slightly less communal oriented than anarcho-communism is the collectivism of the Bakunist and capitalistic private property in exchange. Both begin to appear, even if only in an extremely rudimentary way. After the revolution, says Bakunin in his own, quote, on the morrow of the social revolution, the bourgeoisie will be expropriated. He says the city proletariat will become the owner of capital and of implements of labor, and the rural proletariat of the land which it cultivates with its own hands. The peasants, according to the prominent Bakuninist James Guillaume, will then have the option of either owning and working their plots individually or associating into collectives. Because of the advantages of the collective in creating, quote, a communal agency to sell or exchange their products, end quote, it is expected that the collective will be the dominant form of organization, but no coercion will be used to compel individual peasants to join the collectives. A similar arrangement is envisioned for industry. Large-scale production, of course, would entail collective ownership, but handicrafts and other small industry may well be individually owned. As for remuneration, whereas anarcho-communism intends to follow the formula, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote, the collectivists, at least initially, adhere to the much different maxim of, quote, from each according to his means to each according to his deeds, end quote. All right. To meet their needs, it will be quite natural for the collectives to organize themselves into federations of collectives. Then, as Guillaume describes the operation of the anarcho-collectivist society, he says the workers' associations, as well as the individual producers, will deposit their unconsumed commodities in the facilities provided by the Bank of Exchange. The value of the commodities having been established in advance by a contractual agreement between the regional cooperative federations and the various communes. The Bank of Exchange will remit to the producers negotiable vouchers representing the value of the products. These vouchers will be accepted throughout the territory included in the Federation of Communes. The important difference between anarcho-communism and anarcho-collectivism is that while for the former the wage system and all other market phenomena will be abolished, the collectivists retain not only a modified wage system, but other exchange relationships as well. Guillaume, for example, acknowledges that so long as any products are in short supply, they would have to be treated as commodities with their prices set by the Bank of Exchange according to the dictates of supply and demand. It should be pointed out, however, that the collectivists believe that collective labor will be so productive that all shortages will eventually disappear, and with it the need of any type of price mechanism. Once this plateau of plenty is reached, the structures of anarcho-communism and anarcho-collectivism will become practically indistinguishable. C. Anarcho-syndicalism. Syndicalism is both an organizational structure and a method of overthrowing the capitalist system. As a method, syndicalism, as popularized by Georges Sorel, is a movement premised on the, quote, myth of the general strike, end quote, and the use of force. Violence, it is held, is necessary to overthrow both capitalism and the capitalist state. But to galvanize the workers into action, they must believe in the inexorable triumph of their cause. It is this function that the quote-unquote myth fulfills. For by believing that the general strike will produce the triumph of their cause, it brings into relief the class antagonisms of the capitalist system. In doing so, it unites the proletariat, producing an quote epic state of mind, end quote, which rouses the proletariat to acts of quote unquote heroism. This triumph of the proletarian will eventually culminate in the overthrow of capitalism. Belief in the myth of their inevitable victory, in other words, produces a will to action that does, indeed, make their victory inevitable. Such, briefly, is the method of syndicalism. We are most interested, however, in the organizational framework that will prevail once syndicalism has triumphed. There is an important difference between syndicalism and communism in the question of the ownership of the means of production. While both aim to expropriate these from the capitalist, under communism, as envisioned by Kropotkin, all workers would collectively own all capital. Under syndicalism, however, only those workers in a particular industry would own the means of production within that industry. This bears an obvious resemblance to the collectivism of Bakunin, and Bakuninism may actually be seen as a variant of syndicalism, as can the mutualism of Proudhon. The essential aspect of syndicalism is workers' control according to an industry. While these syndicates or industrial organizations are to be autonomous, they are nevertheless to be loosely confederated, both geographically as well as functionally. The workers in each locality, according to Rudolf Rocker, will join the unions of their respective trades. All the unions in a given region will then be combined into labor chambers. It would be the responsibility of the labor chambers, quote, to determine the needs of the inhabitants of their districts and organize local consumption, end quote. On the other hand, every trade union is to be, quote, federatively allied with all the organizations of the same industry and then in turn with all related trades so that all are combined in general industry and agricultural alliances, end quote. It would be, quote, it would be the task of the industrial and agricultural alliances to take control of all instruments of production, transportation, etc., and provide the separate producing groups with what they need. In short, workers are to be organized functionally through the Federation of Industrial Alliances, which would coordinate production, and geographically through the Federation of Labor Chambers, which would handle the problems of distribution and consumption. Anarcho-syndicates maintain that syndicalism would accomplish the complete overthrow of the wage system, end quote. But since the income of each worker owner is directly tied not only to the physical output of his own industry, but to the demand for that output, it would be more accurate to view syndicalism as a modification rather than the abolition of the wage system. In fact, while it may be too strong to call it workers' capitalism, it should be pointed out that its very structure forces the workers to be not only workers and owners, but capitalists and entrepreneurs as well. But this means that each syndicate would have to decide such questions as whether to expand or curtail production in any given period, how much of its gross revenue to reinvest and how much to divide between the members of the syndicate, whether to cease operations in one area or begin them in another, whether to use more labor and less machinery or vice versa, etc. These are entrepreneurial decisions and are invariably made within an environment of uncertainty and risk. And just as some entrepreneurs make the correct decisions and succeed while others fail, under syndicalism, some syndicates might prosper, but others would surely fail. For no system can eradicate the uncertainty of the future. Not only may tastes change, for example, but an invention may render a particular syndicate obsolete. Not only would syndicalism have to make entrepreneurial decisions just as done under capitalism, but one must question whether quote-unquote workers' control is even possible. The crucial problem for syndicalism is whether or not the individual members of the syndicates would be permitted to sell their shares to other individuals or syndicates. Either way creates a dilemma for the concept of workers' control. For if they are not permitted to sell their shares, then they cannot be said to really own their portion of the industry. Since, sociologically, ownership is defined as the power to dispose of property, that individual or group within the syndicate with the power to prevent the worker from selling, quote, his share to whom he wishes is the actual owner and controller. Rather than workers' control, there has merely been a change in form. One set of owners has replaced another. But if individuals within each industry really own a share of that industry, then they must be permitted to dispose of their shares as they see fit. This means that they can sell their shares to those outside of the industry. But such a policy would entail an end to quote-unquote workers' control and a reemergence of the separation of ownership and labor, which it was the aim of syndicalism to overcome. Similarly, the same dilemma presents itself if the original workers, owners of the more prosperous syndicates decide to hire workers as simple wage earners and not as part owners of the industry. To prevent them would be a denial of worker control, but so too would adoption of such a policy. Again, things would tend to return to pre-syndicalist, i.e. capitalist, state of affairs. Thus, while syndicalism may aim to eliminate private ownership of the means of production, the wage system, the market, and economic inequality, the structure of syndicalism itself forces a return to the paraphernalia of the market, if only in a somewhat modified form. So, example D, mutualism. So we're talking about mutualism now. Despite his famous remark that property is theft, Proudhon was, in fact, a staunch defender of the small property owner. He distinguished between property, in effect absentee ownership, and possession. His argument was that the land really belonged to those who worked it, and hence possession, or occupancy, negated property. He not only defended private ownership, but the rights of barter, sale, and hereditary property as well, and felt that individual liberty could be protected only if property were subject to no restrictions but that of size. The three cornerstones of Proudhon's ideal society are contract, exchange, and property. The state is to be abolished, and all relations between individuals and collectives are to be handled by contract. Quote, the notion of contract precludes that of government, end quote, writes Proudhon. And again, Proudhon says, instead of laws, we would have contracts. No laws would be passed either by majority vote or unanimously. Each citizen, each commune or corporation would make its own laws, end quote. The corollary of contract is exchange. People contract with each other to exchange their products. Accordingly, Proudhon defines mutualism as quote-unquote service for service, product for product. Proudhon was not so much an opponent to the capitalistic market system as of industrialism. He envisioned a society of numerous small and independent producers voluntarily contracting to exchange their products on an equitable basis. Where the nature of production makes such a framework impossible, Proudhon advocates a syndicalist arrangement where the workers in each industry would own the means of production in that industry. Relations between the syndicates and other syndicates or individual producers are not to be handled in the same way as relationships between individual producers. Exchange for contract. But for contract and exchange to be meaningful, there must be private ownership. One cannot exchange what one does not own. Proudhon, in fact, proclaims that property, quote, is the only power that can act as a counterweight to the state, end quote. Thus, property, he says, is the basis of my system of federation, end quote. It is not surprising to find, therefore, that Proudhon was in fact a bitter opponent of communism, which he defined as, quote, the exploitation of the strong by the weak, end quote. Any society failing to recognize the right of private property, he felt, must inevitably breed a stultifying rigidity and uniformity that is incompatible with what he called the free exercise of our faculties, our noblest dreams, our deepest feelings. On the question of crime in an anarchist society, Proudhon thought that contract was the sine qua non of justice, and that a fully contractual society would be a fully just one. And he further believed, perhaps naively, that a just society would alleviate much of the tendency toward that and need for criminal behavior. The occasional antisocial individual, Proudhon thought, could be handled through the method of voluntary reparation. The criminal would be asked to make reparation to his victim, and the threat of being the target of public disapprobation, if he refused, would all but ensure compliance. And since reparation accords the criminal, quote, as much respect as he lost through his crime, his reparation is also a rehabilitation, end quote. Finally, anyone regularly violating the norms of society and refusing to make reparation, what Proudhon terms the, quote, hopelessly obdurate scoundrel, can legitimately be subjected to physical suffering and even death. In short, despite Proudhon's famous statement on property and his regular condemnations of capitalism, the essential components of mutualism are private property, exchange, and contract. With the one significant exception of his stricture concerning the size of property, mutualism is, in most other respects, not incompatible with capitalism. Sorry about that. I thought I heard somebody coming down my stairs in the other room. Anyways, to continue with E, Godwinism. H.N. Brailsford says that of Godwin that intensely equalitarian, he permits property only that it may be given away. A close look at William Godwin, however, reveals that despite his repeated condemnations of accumulated property, he was probably an even more vigorous defender of private ownership than Proudhon. The idea of property, says Godwin, quote, is a deduction from the right of private judgment, end quote. Thus, he continues, property is, in the last resort, the palladium of all that ought to be dear to us, and must never be approached but with awe and veneration. In fact, while otherwise eschewing violence, Godwin even goes so far as to remark that the right of property, with all its inequalities, should be defended if need by coercion. Godwin views property according to 3 degrees. He calls it 3 degrees. The first and most fundamental is that a person may own property provided, quote, a greater sum of benefit or pleasure will result than could have arisen from their being otherwise appropriated. From this, he believes it follows, quote, that no man may, in ordinary cases, make use of my apartment, furniture or garments, or of my food, without first having obtained my consent, end quote. The crucial function of the first degree of property is that if everyone is granted a certain sphere of property, no one would be subject to the whims of another. Hence, property will provide everyone with a sphere of action where he can exercise his judgment free from the influence of others. The second degree of property is the right of every man, quote, over the produce of his labor, end quote. While this is less fundamental than the first degree, the latter does not automatically take precedence. Instead, the first degree can only be attained by persuasion and the force of public opinion. The third degree is any system, quote, by which one man enters into the faculty of disposing of the produce of the labor or another man's industry. Accumulated property, of which inheritance is one form, enables one to exercise power over another man's labor and is in, quote, direct contradiction to the second, end quote. But even though Godwin terms this degree of property as wrong, it is significant that he opposes any active measures to abolish the system. He says if by positive institutions the property of every man were equalized today, it would become unequal tomorrow. The same evils would spring up with a rapid growth. In fact, the cure, he says, since it would be affected by coercion, would be worse than the evil. The only effective way Godwin sees to alter the prevailing structure of property is through the same method that he envisions antisocial behavior being handled. He calls it a revolution on opinions. That was just... Mankind is not naturally vicious, but has been corrupted by the unnecessarily complex institutions of political authority. He argues simplify the social structure, and the resulting freedom will stimulate the gradual development of individual responsibility, which, in turn, means that we may expect the whole species to become reasonable and virtuous. It would then be sufficient for local juries operating in Platonic fashion by judging each case on its own merits, simply to make public recommendations. Godwin is confident that no physical enforcement would be necessary, for, quote, where the empire of reason was so universally acknowledged, end quote, any offender resisting the public reprimand of the jury, quote, would feel so uneasy under the unequivocal disapprobation and the observant eye of public judgment. Either to finally comply or, quote, to remove to a society more congenial to his errors, end quote. And just as public opinion would be sufficient to regulate antisocial behavior, so, Godwin believes, it would be equally capable of regulating the abuses of property. If in any society, quote, an accumulation and monopoly be regarded as the seals of mischief, injustice, and dishonor, instead of being treated as titles to attention and deference, in that society the accommodations of human life will tend to their level, and inequality of conditions will be destroyed. Since Godwin, like Proudhon, calls for the abolition of the state, it is not the property of mercantilism, but of capitalism that he defends. Despite the fact that Godwin heaps moral condemnation upon the process of capital accumulation, it is most significant that he flatly rejects attempts to prevent it and clearly sees inequality of property as a lesser evil than the resort to coercion. Thus, his views on property are, in fact, largely compatible with the capitalist system. Okay. F. I'm sorry. I keep hearing this squeak from across the room. I don't know what it is, but we'll just push forward. F is egoism. The essence of Max Stirner's anarchism was each individual's uniqueness. Onus, he wrote, is my whole being and existence. It is I myself. I am free from what I am rid of, the owner of what I have in my power or what I control. Since egoism opposes the subjection of the individual to any external authority, Stirner flatly rejects not only the state, but all moral codes as well. However, it does not follow that egoism entails either the isolation of the individual, as some have implied, or a war of all against all, producing a Hobbesian world where life is, quote, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote. On the contrary, Stirner claims that contemporary society is not a genuinely human society, for only when the human beings acts qua human being, i.e., unencumbered by external social restraints, can his actions be considered truly human. And since contemporary society is maintained in part through the compulsions of state and church, it follows that it is not a genuine society. It is unfortunate that Stirner, in propounding what may be termed the quote-unquote philosophy of the pure individual, was not more specific in outlining his alternative socio-political order, but his scattered remarks on the subject make it quite clear that he did not believe that a stateless and amoral society would be either chaotic or brutish. Since every individual is dependent upon others in varying degrees for the satisfaction of his physical needs for food, shelter, and clothing, as well as his psychological needs for love and companionship, individuals, acting purely out of a regard for their own self-interests, would be motivated to cooperate with one another. Groups of like-minded egoists, says James Martin, quote, would be drawn together voluntarily by the attraction of their mutual interests, end quote, to form a truly human association, i.e. what Stirner terms as a union of egoists. Since insecurity is a most unpleasant sensation, the members of nearly every union would agree to forego the use of force, and any member of failing to abide by this rule could presumably be physically punished or expelled from the union. And further, while there are neither rights nor duties, and power is the be-all and end-all, so that one owns only what he has to power to control, it is clear that Stirner believes that the utility of a secure property structure would encourage the unions to protect that institution. He writes, unions will multiply the individual's means and secure his assailed property. As in other types of anarchism, the egoist writings of Stirner contain a sustained condemnation of capitalism and quote-unquote legal property. A closer view, however, makes it evident that what Stirner opposes is actually the mercantilist or state capitalist system. Thus, he writes that, quote, the state is a commoner's or merchant's state. Under the regime of the commonality, he says, the laborers always fall into the hands of the possessors, i.e. of those who have at their disposal some bit of the state's domains, especially money and land, of the capitalist, therefore. And again, the commoner is what he is, though the protection, through the protection of the state, through the state's grace. These statements, in themselves, are compatible with free market capitalism. Further, Stirner was such a bitter opponent of any type of communism that Karl Marx wrote that Stirner's, quote, egoistical property is nothing more than ordinary or bourgeois property sanctified, end quote. So while he was vague concerning what role the market and private property would play in a Stirnerite society, Charles Madison accurately captures the thrust of Stirnerism when he remarks that, quote, ironically enough, the hard selfishness of this individualist anarchism was admirably adapted to the rugged individualism of modern capitalism, end quote. It might also be pointed out that such prominent exponents of egoism as John Babcock and John Henry Mackay considered private property sacrosanct and reserved a central role for voluntary contract in exchange for mutual benefit. But both, it should be noted, were also heavily influenced by the prominent individualist or philosophical anarchist Benjamin Tucker. Okay, G, philosophical anarchism. What is usually termed the philosophical anarchist tradition received its fullest expression in the writings of the 19th century American anarchists, and in particular Benjamin Tucker and Victor Yaros. Tucker, like other anarchists, couched his arguments in socialist terminology. Yet, an examination of his ideas, as well as those of his followers, placed them squarely within the capitalist framework. He was an ardent opponent of communism, and a staunch defender of the free market, private property, and the wage system, and advocated what may be termed laissez-faire socialism. As in the case of Stirner and Proudhon, what Tucker condemned was not free market capitalism, but state capitalism and mercantilism. He said the only reason why the banker, the stockholder, the manufacturer, and the merchant are able to extract usury from labor lies in the fact that they are backed by legal privilege or monopoly. The way to eliminate these monopolies is by subjecting capital to the natural law of competition, thus bringing the price of its use down to cost. He would apply freedom of competition to, quote, the money monopoly, the land monopoly, the tariff monopoly, and the patent and copyright monopoly. The first, felt Tucker, would eliminate interest, the second, rent, the third and fourth, profits. The elimination of these monopolies by means of total laissez-faire would ensure that the laborer would get the full value of his labor. A fundamental difference between the philosophical anarchists and all of the other types discussed thus far is their great faith in their ability of the market to control spontaneously the problem of power in society. This is clearly illustrated in Tucker's position on the proper handling of trusts. Since every individual has the right to dispose of his property as he sees fits, and since, Tucker argued, trusts are simply groups of individuals, they have the same rights as isolated individuals. Hence, the trust, quote, endeavoring to do collectively nothing but what each member of the combination rightfully may endeavor to do individually, is, per se, an unimpeachable institution, end quote. So long as the trust is not supported by legal privileges, it can only remain in operation by selling more cheaply than any actual or potential competitor, which, of course, makes it a beneficial institution. If it is not beneficial, it will succumb to the challenge of competition and fall apart. According to the Tuckerites, everything, including police protection, should be handled on the market and be subject to the rigors of competition. Despite the fact that Tucker couches his positions in socialist terminology, his quote-unquote laissez-faire socialism falls squarely with the capitalist system. H. Individualist anarchism. The contemporary individualist anarchists, such as Murray Rothbard, agree with the overall structure of the Tuckerites. The state is to be abolished and everything is to be handled by, or at least open to the possibility of, competition on the free market. There is one significant difference, however. While Tucker, adhering to the labor theory of value, felt that competition would reduce price to cost, thereby eliminating profits, rents, and interest, the individualist anarchists reject the labor theory of value and adopt, in its place, the subjective value marginal utility approach. Free competition would indeed tend to reduce prices and raise wages, they say, but the Tuckerites are in error in believing that this means that profits and interest would also disappear. Instead, their maintenance is seen as a requisite for economic rationality and even society itself. Okay, so that's section 1. Section 2, the political spectrum of capitalism, anarchism to hyperarchism. A brief overview of the economic spectrum of anarchism revealed a wide array of economic arrangements. Similarly, the proponents of capitalism traverse the entire political spectrum from anarchism to what may be called hyperarchism. Only by viewing this array of groups and then comparing the political spectrum of capitalism with the economic spectrum of anarchism can the relative positions of the individualist or free market anarchists be ascertained. Okay. A. Individualist anarchism. The previous discussion of individualist anarchism focused on its place in the anarchist school. Its position within the capitalist spectrum still needs to be discerned. The sanctity of private property and the market lie at the heart of laissez-faire capitalism. From a logical point of view, the more things are handled by the market, the more capitalistic the society. Consistently applied, argue the individualist anarchists, capitalism leads to anarchism. Hence, they argue, the minarchists, or limited government libertarians, place themselves in a contradiction for, while believing that property rights must be protected and the market maintained, they also believe that these services, the police and court functions, are by their nature collective and cannot be provided by the market. Thus, they are forced to rely on an agency outside the market, i.e., the government. The minarchists, it is argued, are placed in the contradictory position of relying on a non-market institution to defend the market. Further, since to meet operating expenses, a government is forced to collect taxes, which constitutes a forcible transfer of wealth from its rightful owners to others and therefore is a violation of property rights, the minarchists are also in the embarrassing position of relying, for the protection of property rights, on an institution that by its very nature entails the invasion of property rights. The individualist anarchist then proceeds to push the anti-statist elements in libertarianism to their logical extreme: the elimination of government and total reliance on the market. The whole concept of quote-unquote collective goods is rejected. All goods and services, including those supplied by government, can be broken down into marginal units and sold on the market. Thus runs their argument: government can be completely dispensed with and its functions performed voluntarily by defense agencies, court companies, road companies, etc. Not only can these services be supplied better, more efficiently, and less expensively on the market, they argue, but more importantly, the perennial threat of tyranny resulting from government monopoly of the use of force would be eliminated. The limited government, however, maintains that the libertarian anarchist has placed himself in a dilemma. For permitting the market to operate in the choice of such things as police protection and legal codes means that justice will be determined by the highest bidders. But this, in turn, means that a libertarian legal code will emerge from an anarchist society only if the society itself is overwhelmingly libertarian. But if there were sufficient demand for, say, the suppression of nude swimming or marijuana smoking, an individualist anarchist society would produce laws prohibiting such activities as well as defense agencies willing to enforce them. Thus, an individualist anarchist community contains the distinct possibility that economic classes, such as the poor, or minorities, such as blacks, redheads, ladies of the evening, and the like, would find themselves being subjected to restrictive measures that squarely contradict the principles of libertarianism. In short, the dilemma of individualist anarchism, argue its critics, is that its very structural framework renders it incapable of protecting the substantive libertarian principles it purports to cherish. Whether individualist anarchism is beset by such an internal contradiction will be examined in greater depth in a later chapter. Suffice it to be said at this point that if true, this would constitute a telling blow. Indeed, for the Rothbardian, or natural rights variant of individualist anarchism. Okay, example B is ultra-minarchism. Remarkably close to the individualist anarchists are the views of the philosopher John Hospers. While Hospers' outline of his ideal society order is sketchy, certain aspects of it are clear. First of all, everyone is held to have such quote-unquote human rights as those to life, liberty, and property. The sole function of government is the protection of these rights, and a government is legitimate so long as it restricts its activities to this sphere. But as soon as it exceeds this sphere, it becomes an aggressor. Second, since an absolutely fundamental right is that to property, Hospers denies that there can be any rights in the absence of property rights. And since taxation is a clear violation of property rights, there would be no taxation by a Hosperian government. The government, he believes, could support itself through a fee-for-service policy. The only time anyone would pay anything to a government agency would be that when, and to the extent that, he chose to avail himself of a government service. No one, however, would be forced to receive or pay for any service he didn't desire. Thus, an individual would be free to interact with others, including signing a contract. However, if one desired to insure himself against the possibility of contractual default, he could, upon signing the contract, pay a fee to the government, granting him access to the courts in the event of any contractual dispute. This fee, which Hospers reluctantly terms a quote-unquote contract tax, would be voluntary. People would only pay the fee if they found it in their interest to do so. However, since a Hosperian state would be so minuscule, and since, quote, most people would find it to their interest to pay the fee, he is, end quote, he is confident that the government would be supported in this manner. A very similar arrangement is suggested for police protection. While Hospers feels that statutory law, and thus a government, is necessary to ensure a rule of law, he sees no reason why the government would have to enforce its own law. In fact, he acknowledges that private police forces are doubtless much more efficient than those run by the government. Excuse me, just one second. There is therefore an economic advantage to permitting police protection to be handled entirely by the market. The only restriction that would be necessary to impose upon these private police companies, a restriction that Hospers feels would be impossible to impose in an anarchist society, is that, he says, they should be able to enforce only the law of the land, end quote. Beyond this, police companies would have complete freedom to compete against one another, just like firms in any other field. Anyone desiring police protection could purchase from the firm of his choice. And while no one would be compelled to purchase protection, only those paying the protection fee would receive protection. Hospers continues, if you want police protection, you have to pay a fee to obtain it. But of course, you are free not to want it or pay for it, in which case you will not have the protection even if you need it. In short, Hospers maintains that while, he says, laws should be enacted by the state, the enforcement of them might be left to private agencies. The provision of both police and court services would be handled on a fee-for-service basis, with individuals free to purchase or not to purchase these services as they see fit, but unable to purchase the services of any maverick police agency or court which adhered to norms at variance with those laid down by the state. It is interesting to note that since a Hosperian state would render protection only to those purchasing it, it does not meet the criterion of a minimal state which, by definition, must provide protection for everyone within its territorial boundaries, regardless of payment. We may therefore borrow a term coined by philosopher Robert Nozick and refer to Hospers as ultra-minarchist. But it is possible that even with this appellation, appellation is too strong. One of the essential criteria of a quote-unquote state is that it must be generally recognized as exercising a legitimate monopoly on the use of force within a given area. But since in Hosperian society, the use of force would presumably be handled not by the quote-unquote government, but entirely by private police agencies, this raises the question of whether the Hosperian framework meets this monopoly criterion. Hospers might, of course, argue that his entire system, the legislature plus fee-for-service courts and the private police agencies, constitutes a state, quote-unquote state. But however one may resolve such definitional problems, this still leaves open the really crucial question of how, if the use of force is to be left up to the private police agencies, could the Hosperian proviso that these agencies must only enforce the legislature's statutory laws be enforced? What would happen if one or two or a dozen enforcement agencies started enforcing norms that conflicted with the laws enacted by the legislatures? There are, so far as I can see, two possible scenarios. First, Hospers might contend that since these maverick agencies would clearly be acting illegally, Either they would not receive public patronage and so go out of business, or other police agencies, perceiving the threat of the illegals, would join forces to crush them. But since these are exactly the same measures Rothbardian anarchists rely on to ensure the enforcement of their common law, Hosper's ultra-minarchism becomes all but indistinguishable from Rothbardian anarchism. But Hospers might argue for a second course, that of permitting the public legislature to diversify into the provision of police services. The public agency might then not only enact laws, but have enough force at its disposal to punish or crush any maverick agency. But since Hospers admits that private agencies are much more efficient than public ones, it is difficult to see why anyone would purchase protection from the latter. Consequently, the only ways the public agency could remain in business would be by either outlawing not just maverick but all private policy agencies, or by changing every police agency or by charging every police agency a fee sufficiently high to cover the public agency's losses. Since the public agency would now hold an effective monopoly on the use of force, it would meet the criteria for a state. Although if it continued to operate on a fee-for-service basis, it would remain a less than minimal state. But it must be noted, neither of these options can be reconciled with libertarian principles. The outlawing of all private agencies would constitute a restriction on peaceful activities. While the fee charged every agency by neither voluntary nor paid in exchange for services rendered. It would therefore be a tax in the full sense of that word. In short, Hospers is placed in a dilemma. Either he must accede in some restriction on peaceful activities or taxation, thereby violating his libertarianism, or he must rely for the enforcement of his quote-unquote statutory law on the non-monopolistic mechanisms, thereby abandoning his anarchism. Thus, Hosperian ultra-minarchism appears to contain a serious internal contradiction which would logically compel it to move either to complete anarchism or full-fledged minarchism. Hold on one second. Speaking of which, minarchism. Those who do not believe that a market for protection services would be either economically viable or morally permissible must therefore endorse some sort of state. And those within that group who maintain the provision of such services is the only proper function of government must therefore advocate a minimal or completely laissez-faire state. The minarchist position has received its most recent and perhaps ableist, at any rate most ingenious, expression in the invisible hand argument of philosopher Robert Nozick. Nozick begins with a discussion of a hypothetical free market anarchist society. But protective services, he says, differ from other types of services in that they employ the use of coercion. Therefore, in defending their respective clients, they would come into conflict with each other, the result being that one dominant protective agency would eliminate its competition and emerge as the single such agency in a particular geographical region. This, says Nozick, would constitute an ultra-minimal state, as he calls it, which differs from the minimal state of the classical liberals in that the former, by the law of supply and demand, eliminates its competition in a particular area, hereby maintaining, quote, a monopoly over the use of force, end quote, but providing, quote, protection and enforcement services only to those who would purchase its protection and enforcement policies. The classical liberal state, on the other hand, held a legal monopoly over the use of force and supplied protection services to all of its citizens. But, argues Nozick, the ultra-minimal state will soon transform itself into a minimal state For under an ultra-minimal state, individuals would still be free to extract quote-unquote private justice. But, quote, the knowledge that one is living under a system permitting this itself produces apprehension, end quote, with individuals never knowing how or when they may receive retribution from a private agent. Fear will pervade the entire society. Thus, private justice constitutes a public wrong. To protect its clients, the dominant protective agency may then prohibit the independents from such self-help enforcement. This will not mean that the independents will be left defenseless, for, contends Nozick, according to the principle of compensation, the clients of the protective agency must compensate the independents for the disadvantages imposed upon them by being prohibited self-help enforcement of their own rights against the agency's clients. Undoubtedly, the least expensive way to compensate the independents would be to supply them with protective services to cover those situations of conflict with the paying customers of the protective agency. This will not lead to free riders, he insists, for the agency protects these independents. It compensates only against its own paying clients on whom the independents are forbidden to use self-help enforcement. The more free riders there are, the more desirable it is to be a client always protected by the agency. God damn it. While believing that this argument has justified the state, Nozick then proceeds to point out that given natural rights, which he admits he merely assumes rather than demonstrates, anything beyond the minimal state, including taxation, entails the violation of those rights, since it means the initiation of force against peaceful individuals. Hence, the minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified. While this is a most intriguing argument, it is not at all clear that Nozick has, in fact, succeeded in justifying the minimal state. For a minimal state, he notes, must A, exercise or come close to exercising a monopoly on the use of force within a given territory, and B, provide everyone within its domain with protection. But while the dominant protection agency would prohibit self-help enforcement among its own clients and between independents and clients, its domain, Nozick says, in a significant passage, quote, does not extend to quarrels of non-clients among themselves, end quote. Nozick's dominant protection agency, therefore, falls short of his own criteria for a minimal state. In fact, such independent agencies would continue to operate so long as they didn't confront the dominant agency. It is not even clear that the latter would constitute an ultra-minimal state, which requires the provision of protection services by a single agency. Nozick, it should be noted, is aware of this difficulty and reacts to it by simply relaxing his criteria. He then refers to the dominant agency as a quote-unquote state-like entity instead of simply a state. There is, however, the potential for an additional problem. Suppose, theorizes Roy Childs, that in the midst of an established minimal state, an agency arises which uses procedures identical to those of the state's agents. Since, under this condition, the incipient agency could not be any more risky than the state, a state operating on Nozickian principles would have no grounds for prohibiting its activities. But, continues Childs, since the state was already compensating those who would have patronized agencies using risky procedures, the new agency would not have to assume this burden and could therefore charge lower prices for the same quality service. This would, in turn, create an economic incentive for people to subscribe to the new agency, thereby forcing the minimal state to abandon its own compensation policy. But this would mean that the minimal state had reverted to the ultra-minimal state. But, continues Childs, provided the new agency continued to win new clients and other entrepreneurs, seeing the success of the new agency, entered the field themselves, the ultra-minimal state would degenerate into a mere dominant agency, and eventually that into, quote, simply one agency among many, end quote. In short, Childs argues there is no reason, on strictly Nozickian grounds, why the invisible hand could not strike back. But regardless of how it is justified, the minarchist advocates a single agency with a monopoly on the use of force in society and whose sole function is the protection of individual rights. Okay. D. Evolutionary individualist anarchism. An interesting view, which proposed a minimal state for the present while espousing an anarchist society for the future, was that advanced by the 19th century English philosopher Herbert Spencer and the French economist Frédéric Bastiat. Both condemned any extension of government beyond the minimum necessary to protect the natural rights of every individual. Spencer argues that, quote, every man has freedom to do as he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of every other man. From this it follows, he believed, that if government does anything more than protect individual rights, he says it becomes an aggressor instead of a protector. Thus, Spencer was an ardent opponent not only of regulation of commerce, religion, health, education, etc., but of taxation as well. Indeed, Spencer goes even further and declares that the individual has a quote-unquote right to ignore the state. His reasoning is instructive. He says, if every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided that he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection to the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying toward its support. It is self-evident that in so behaving, he in no way trenches upon the liberty of others. It is equally self-evident that he cannot be compelled to continue as one of a political corporation, seeing that citizenship involves payment of taxes, and taking away a man's property against his will is an infringement on his rights. Having laid the philosophical groundwork for anarchism, Spencer goes a step further. He says the power of self-government can be developed only by exercise. End quote. The more man is forced to accept responsibility for his own actions, the more responsible and far-sighted he will become. And the more he so becomes, the less he will transgress the rights of others. Thus, quote, it is a mistake to assume that government must necessarily last forever. The institution marks a certain stage of civilization, is natural to a particular phase of human development, but as civilization advances, he says, does government decay. Very similar to the writings of Herbert Spencer are those of Frédéric Bastiat. Each of us, quote, has a natural right to defend his person, his liberty, and his property, end quote. And as soon as government exceeds this protective function, it becomes an agency of, quote unquote, legal plunder. And the law, quote, instead of checking injustice, becomes the invincible weapon of injustice, end quote. Like Spencer, Bastiat also goes a step further. While weak and frail now, mankind is perfectible. Provided society is free and government is the oppressor and not the agent of plunder, the natural law will prevail and the consequences of each individual's actions will redound upon himself. If they are pleasurable, he will repeat them. If painful, he ceases. Further, since individuals have intellects, they are capable of transmitting to others what they have learned. While Bastiat refrains from clearly stating the logical conclusions of his analysis, the components of evolutionary anarchism are present. Government's only proper function is to suppress crime, but by the, quote, law of responsibility, end quote, crime will eventually disappear. Thus man will one day live in harmony and without government. There is one fundamental difference between the individualist anarchists and the evolutionary anarchists. While both are ardent supporters of the market, The latter did not consider extending market analysis into the realm of police and the courts. Anarchism, for Spencer and Bastiat, would be possible only when man has progressed to the point of self-government, not before. The key question, of course, is whether that state of moral perfection is an attainable one. Fucking mute button's not working. Objectivism. The objectivists, headed by Ayn Rand, may be viewed as a variant of minarchism. Not only do they advocate a minimal state, but also, like the minarchists, oppose taxation as a form of involuntary servitude. The starting point for the objectivists is the cognition that life in society presupposes the repudiation of the initiatory use of violence. Say that 5 times fast. But, says Rand, quote, if physical force is to be barred from social relationships, men need an institution charged with the task of protecting their rights under the objective code of rules. And an objective code of rules, she believes, precludes the possibility of competition in this area. It is this fundamental incompatibility of force and production that is ignored by the anarchists. Suppose, says Rand in her critique of what she calls the anarchist theory of competing governments, that, she says, I guess, Mr. Smith, a customer of government A, suspects that his next-door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of government B, has robbed him. A squad of police A proceeds to Mr. Jones's house and is met at the door by a squad of police B, who declare that they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of government A. What happens then? You take it from there. But while a government defined as, quote, an institution that holds exclusive power to enforce certain rules of social conduct in a given geographical area, end quote, is absolutely necessary, its only proper function is the protection of individual rights. Moreover, since the right to property is a most fundamental right, taxation would be immoral. And Rand, therefore, opts for what she terms voluntary government financing. The wealthy strata, who would have the most to lose if there were no agency to protect individual rights, would, she maintains, contract to contribute to the maintenance of this function. And since she believes that police protection is a collective good, quote, those on the lowest economic levels would be virtually exempt, though they would still enjoy the benefits of legal protection, end quote. The great merit of this arrangement, she says, is that it would keep government to a minimum. She says men would pay voluntarily for insurance protecting their contracts, but would not pay voluntarily for insurance against the dangers of aggression by Cambodia. Beyond these rather vague and cursory remarks, Rand has written very little to further clarify her concept of proper government. Some attention should therefore be paid to the series of articles by the objectivist Paul Bayard, purporting to delineate and expand upon the Randian views of government. According to Bayard, the crucial distinction between the Rothbardian anarchist and the Randian objectivist proposals for the rendering of police protection is the latter is predicated upon the concept of territorial jurisdiction, while that notion is completely absent in the former. Because Rothbardian anarchism, quote, lacks the geographical definition of jurisdiction, end quote, competing defense agencies offering different policies and enforcing different laws will operate on the same terrain. The result will be that, quote, a person cannot be safe from the potential interference of unchosen defense agencies even on his own territory, end quote. The concept of jurisdiction solves this problem by establishing a single enforcement agency with exclusive power to enforce rules of conduct within a clearly demarcated territory. The extent of any government's jurisdiction, he says, would be determined by the individual decision of each property owner. He says the area of a proper government's authority extends no further than the property lines of the lands owned by its citizens. When a person subscribes to a proper government, his land is added to its jurisdiction. This, he claims, ensures that a government will always be based on the consent of the governed. For the moment any property owner is no longer satisfied with his government, he can secede from it and proceed, quote, to contract with another government, or provide his own, or provide for none. Consequently, the application of objectivist principles may well, quote, result in a map of a government jurisdiction looking like a patchwork, with the patches being separated from each other by the lands governed by other governments. This is a most curious piece indeed, for while it purports merely to propound and clarify the Randian position on government, it clearly conflicts with the position on three fundamental points. According to the logic of the Bayardian analysis, every property owner would have the right to contract with the government of his choice, but this can only mean that all governments would operate on a fee-for-service basis. For any government endeavoring to provide free protection for the poor would be forced to raise its premiums to cover the subsidy. But this, of course, would encourage its patrons to seek protection from other governments, not providing a subsidy and therefore in a position to offer lower rates. Thus, under the Bayardian proposal, only those paying for protection would receive it. But this is clearly at odds with Rand's assertion that under an objectivist government, everyone, including the poor, would receive protection. Thus, while Rand opts for a minarchist state, Bayard's proposal would be consistent with, at most, an ultra-minarchist state. Secondly, Rand's major criticism of free market anarchism is its failure to solve the problem of jurisdiction. Bayard, of course, reiterates this criticism and maintains that this would not be a problem under his proposal, since he says only one government would have authority on a plot of land at a time. But surely this would not be sufficient to alleviate the jurisdictional problem. Ironically, Rand's criticism of anarchism would apply with equal, if not greater force, if this Rand a la Bayard proposal. For it would certainly be possible for a Bayardian society to be confronted with a situation in which Mr. Smith, a customer of government A, suspects that his neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of government B, has robbed him, and neither government recognizes the other as legitimate. In fact, if every property owner were free to subscribe to the government of his choice, the number of governments would be likely to increase enormously. Theoretically, there could be as many governments as property owners, thereby magnifying the potential for the type of jurisdictional problems Rand is so anxious to avoid. Finally, it is interesting that Rand calls the idea of competing governments, the idea that every citizen should be free to shop and to patronize whatever government he chooses, a floating abstraction and a weird absurdity. But how else could one classify the Bayardian proposal except in terms of competing governments and the right of every citizen to shop and to patronize the government of his choice? In short, while Bayard purports to be merely delineating that Randian views on government, there are fundamental conflicts between Rand's and Bayard's interpretation of Rand. Rand is a minarchist, while Bayard is at most an ultra-minarchist. Whether this indicates a flaw in the objectivist philosophy or simply a misinterpretation of objectivism by Bayard, it is both an interesting and difficult question to answer. Fortunately, since we are simply trying to get a fix on the relative positions of competing philosophies, this question need not be answered here. All right. F is classical liberalism. While relying on the market for most things, the classical liberals felt that there were various services that could be supplied only by the state. What they opted for was limited government and representative democracy. The classical liberals can be subdivided into two branches. The doctrinaire or uncompromising liberals who come very close to the contemporary minarchists, and the moderate liberals who would permit state extension into areas beyond that of police and the courts. Probably only a few writers can be said to have been pure on doctrinaire liberals. Among the foremost are Wilhelm von Humboldt and Ludwig von Mises. The argument of the doctrinaire liberals has most clearly been stated by Mises. The essential teaching of liberalism, he says, is that social cooperation and the division of labor can be achieved only in a system of private ownership of the means of production, i.e., a market society of capitalism. All of the other principles of liberalism, including democracy, he says, are consequences of this basic postulate. Thus, while the dogmatic liberal feels that the state should be completely democratized, he also believes that the sphere of the state activity should be severely restricted. Quote, as the liberal sees it, the task of the state consists solely and exclusively in guaranteeing the protection of life, health, liberty, and private property. Everything that goes beyond this is an evil, end quote. In a sense, the doctrinaire liberal places himself in a dilemma. He is ardently in favor of both the free market and democracy, yet the only way the market can remain completely unimpeded is if the scope of government is so circumscribed that its sole function is to protect individual rights. In that case, issues subject to democratic control will be relatively meaningless. But if government expands and more areas are subject to vote, the scope of the market becomes progressively more restricted. Of this problem, Mises can merely hope that the majority will exercise such self-restraint that government will remain minuscule. The doctrinaire liberal also faces another dilemma. On one hand, he is passionate in defending the right of the individual to run his life as he deems fit. Mises, as we have seen, terms the extension of government beyond the protection of rights as an evil. But since government is necessary and since it must have revenue, quote unquote, taxes are necessary. If it is evil to confiscate part of the earnings of individuals for some things, however, why is it not just as evil to confiscate them for other things such as court and police services? To this, Mises can merely say that, quote, the expenditure caused by the apparatus of a liberal community is so small that it will be of little burden to the individual. But the dilemma remains. Taxation, whether large or small, constitutes a violation of the principles of liberalism so cherished by men like Mises. In short, while what government exists is to be democratic, the doctrinaire liberal desires to restrict government activity as much as possible. He is a pro-capitalist first and a Democrat second. The positions are reversed, however, for the moderate liberal, for he is prepared to see, and in fact often advocates, the extension of government into areas that the dogmatic liberal would consider anathema. The prototype of this group, which would include the bulk of the classical liberals, is John Stuart Mill. He says, the purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good is not a sufficient warrant. With such a statement, Mill appears to fall into the dogmatic liberal tradition. But as George Sabine wrote of Mill, he was uncompromising in the abstract. He says, but having stated the principle, he proceeded to make concessions and restatements until, in the end, the original theory was explained away without any new principle being put in its place. Thus, the state may, if it wishes, he says, regulate trade as well as the hours of taverns. It may even confine the powers of selling these commodities to persons of vouched for respectability of conduct. The state has the duty to enforce quote-unquote universal education, and to help to pay the school fees of the poorer classes of children, although parents should be able to obtain the education where and how they pleased. Mill also sanctions the prohibition of actions which may constitute, quote-unquote, a violation of good manners and offenses against decency. Presumably, this could entail regulation of dress in public, the selling of pornographic literature, as well as a host of other activities. Compulsory labor would be permitted to force parents to fulfill their obligations to their children. The state could also forbid marriage between two consenting adults if they cannot demonstrate, quote, that they have the means of supporting a family, end quote. And his principle of political economy, Mill admits of, quote, state protection of children, lunatics, and animals, state interference with joint stock companies, compulsion in the sphere of labor and industry, state charity, state supervision and control of colonization, state promotion of goods such as culture, science, research, etc. As H.J. McCloskey says, Mill allows a great deal of activity by the state toward promoting goods and in restricting and preventing immoralities. One of the foremost contemporary exponents of moderate liberalism is F.A. Hayek. Like Mill, Hayek argues for the market and the supremacy of the individual, yet he quickly modifies this by admitting a host of government activities. He permits state control of most sanitary and health services and the construction and maintenance of roads. He also adds that there are many other kinds of activities in which the government may legitimately wish to engage. The distinction between the doctrinaire and moderate liberals is clear. Both profess to favor the market on the one hand and democracy on the other. But for the doctrinaires, so much would be handled by the market that the scope of issues falling under the state would be so small as to render democratic control most feeble. On the other hand, the moderates would grant much broader state jurisdiction. But as more and more areas are regulated by the state, the scope of the market is restricted and democratic control assumes primary importance. The distinction can be seen in an area like education. The doctrinaire classical liberals believed that education is a good to be purchased on the market like any other good or service. Under such a system, there can be no question of democratic control of education, since it would be entirely outside the scope of government. Individuals would simply purchase the type, quantity, and quality of education they desired. But if education is to be handled democratically, then educational policy will be determined not by the individual purchaser, but by the voting majority. Quite clearly, far from democracy being the counterpart of the market, as though by the classical liberals, the two are incompatible. Thus, the classical liberals place themselves in a dilemma in advocating both democracy and the market. It is not surprising, therefore, to find classical liberalism divided into two factions: the dogmatic classical liberals, such as Mises, who are market proponents first and Democrats second, and the moderate liberals, such as Mill, who are Democrats first and market proponents second. G. Conservatism. There is one final category that falls into the capitalist or free market spectrum: capitalist hyperarchism. While this would entail fairly severe government regulation, it would be limited to the social sphere, such as press and speech, while leaving the market to function freely. Probably conservatism is the group that best fits into this category. The founder of modern conservatism was Edmund Burke, and his followers today would include such figures as Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, and James Burnham. Conservatives are most reluctant to define precisely what they mean by conservatism. Yet certain principles are discernible. They believe that true values manifest themselves over time via the emergence of traditions, and consequently that is the duty of society to preserve and protect these traditions. As a corollary, conservatives are distrustful of human reason. This view was eloquently expressed by Edmund Burke. You see, sir, that in this enlightened age I am bold enough to confess that we are generally men of untaught feelings, that indeed of casting away all our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree, and, to take more shame to ourselves, we cherish them because they are prejudices. And the longer they have lasted, the more we cherish them. We are afraid to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that the individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. Prejudice renders a man's virtue his habit, and not a series of unconnected acts. Through his just prejudice, his duty becomes a part of his nature. One of the conservative traditions is the reluctance to rely on the government to solve social evils. Hence, conservatives opt for a limited government and a generally laissez-faire economic system. But not only do they not oppose the use of force to protect those quote-unquote true values that are viewed as necessary to maintain the social order, they feel it's one's duty to use force for such ends. Thus, force is advocated against such things as pornography, prostitution, labor unions, communism, and the like. Another fact of conservatism is that it consciously eschews delineating a positive program, which it condemns as abstract theorizing. Instead, its overriding characteristic is its resistance to, quote-unquote, the enemy of the permanent things, end quote. The most feared enemy is communism. The conservatives feel that it is a man's moral duty to oppose communism by any means necessary, and therefore advocate the use of government coercion in this regard. The communists, argues noted conservative writer James Burnham, are serious and are irrevocably fixed on their goal of a monopoly of world power. Because the communists are serious, they will have to be stopped by superior power and will. But just possibly we shall not have to die in large numbers to stop them, but we shall certainly have to be willing to die. But as has often been pointed out by their critics, conservatives place themselves in a serious dilemma. First, while they are in general opposed to government power and endorse a market economy, their willingness to use government force to protect, quote-unquote, the permanent things necessitates restrictions on the market that are far from minimal. Further, the fear of the worldwide communist menace has meant their endorsement of a military large enough to defend the West against all challenges and challengers. Not only is it difficult to see how the requirements of such a large military can be reconciled with their espousal of a minimal state, but a huge military can only be financed by massive taxation, which itself constitutes further restrictions on the market. Thus, while the conservatives generally endorse a market economy, they are also perfectly willing to restrict its operations for goals they consider more important. In the insightful comment of L.T. Sargent, the conservative seems to be in the unfortunate position of opposing government power except when it is on his side. It is also difficult to define the political position of the conservatives with any degree of precision. While earlier conservatives such as Burke and de Maistre were opposed to democracy, modern conservatives such as Kirk and Buckley have appeared to reconcile themselves to such a system. Nevertheless, their attachment to democracy seems to be strictly conditional. Democracy is permissible so long as it does not endanger, quote-unquote, the permanent things, the traditions and customs that hold society together. Authority and tradition are viewed as pillars of any tolerable social order, which it is man's sacred duty to preserve at all costs. While the conservatives have never squarely confronted the issue, this presumably means that any time democracy comes into conflict with the permanent things, democracy must be abandoned for the sake of the latter. It is the acknowledgement that government is an indispensable social institution coupled with the reluctance to quote unquote accept the verdicts of democracy's tribunal. That results in the marked authoritarian streak that runs throughout conservative thought. The conservative sees society as an organic whole. If democracy should conflict with the maintenance of the permanent things, it becomes his duty to defend and, if necessary, to sacrifice himself and others for the sake of the preservation of the social order. Thus, the conservatives' commitment to democracy is strictly conditional and masks a deeper authoritarianism that may, at times, border on fascism. All right. Section 3, wrap it up pretty soon. Anarchism encompasses a wide range of economic positions, ranging from anarcho-communism to individualist anarchism. Similarly, the capitalistic economic system is compatible with a spectrum of political structures, ranging from anarchism to hyperarchism. The relationship between these two spectrums, as well as their relationship to other philosophies, can be seen in the following diagram. The political spectrum, ranging from anarchism on the top to hyperarchism on the left, the political spectrum ranging from anarchism on the left to hyperarchism on the right runs across the top. The economic spectrum, ranging from capitalism at the top to communism at the bottom, runs down the page. The unbroken horizontal line across the top indicates the political range of capitalism. The unbroken vertical line indicates the economic scope of anarchism. So box 1 entails both a capitalistic economic system and an anarchistic political structure. This would include the contemporary individualist anarchists such as Rothbard and Friedman, as well as the philosophical anarchists such as Tucker and Spooner. Still squarely within the anarchist spectrum, but moving slightly away from capitalism, would be Stirner and Godwin. On the other hand, somewhat less anarchistic, but still ardently capitalistic, would be the ultra-minarchists such as Hospers. Box 2 entails a limited form of government coupled with a capitalistic economic structure. This would include the minarchists like Nozick, the evolutionary anarchists like Spencer and Bastiat, as well as the objectivists. Also included in this category would be the indoctrinaire classical liberals. Doctrinaire classical liberals such as Humboldt and Mises, and their more moderate counterparts like Mill and Smith, and more currently Hayek. Box 3 entails a highly interventionist state coupled with a market economy. Such a state would restrict its interventionist activities to the social realm, regulating speech, press, drug use, and the like, while permitting the market to function freely. While this category is, perhaps, of rather limited empirical import, probably the closest thing to capitalist hyperarchism would be the conservatism of Burke and de Maistre, and more currently, Buckley, Kirk, and Burnham. Okay, moving right along. Box 4 entails an anarchist political framework as in Box 1, but a less capitalistic economic structure than prevailed in Boxes 1 through 3. There would still be much market phenomena and individual ownership. However, some form of collectivism or workers' control is also envisioned. This would include the mutualism of Proudhon and Warren, and while somewhat more collectively oriented, the syndicalism of Sorel, Rocker, and Goldman. Box 5 entails the limitation of the market by interest group democracy, which extends government into areas that under boxes 1 through 3 would be handled by the market. This includes the modern exponents of pluralism and the partisans of contemporary liberalism and the welfare state, such as John Rawls. Box 6 entails severe limitations on the market. Democracy is also rejected in favor of rule by elites. It includes the mercantilist and cameralists of the 18th century, and the extreme conservatives, as well as the exponents of fascism and Nazism, such as Rockwell and Gentile. Box 7 entails the rejection of the state coupled with a pronounced movement toward a marketless economy. This would include the anarcho-collectivism of Bakunin and more extreme anarcho-communism of Kropotkin. So that's box 7. Box 8 entails a socialist economy coupled with some form of limited statism. It would include the quasi-anarchistic guild socialism with its reliance on functional representation, where the only role for the state is to mediate between the functional groups when controversies could not be otherwise solved or resolved. Close to this would be Fabianism, first founded in 1889, with its emphasis on universal suffrage and municipal or local control of industry. Okay, and so that leaves us finally with box 9. Box 9 entails a socialist or communist economic framework with planning to be done through the instrumentality of the state. This would include the British Labour Party, founded in 1937, with its call for nationalization of industry and a, quote, general state plan, end quote. Close to this is Fabianism, founded in 1908, with emphasis on nationalization of such industries as waterworks, the mines, and the harbors, as well as a large dose of state planning. Okay. Also included in this category would be Marxism, which advocated a planned economy, but one in which all individuals participated in both the planning and the execution of the plans. And the elite planned socialist technocracies outlined by Saint Simon and Edward Bellamy. Another interesting note would be that the Fabian socialists had a hand in creating the British Labour Party itself, but that's a story for another day. If the foregoing is correct, the traditional view that anarchism is incompatible with capitalism is clearly incorrect. Both anarchism and capitalism traverse a wide spectrum of thought, and while some variants of anarchism are incompatible with some variants of capitalism, other types are quite compatible. Moreover, the place of the individualist anarchists in both the economic and the political spectrums has been pointed out, and the initial groundwork has been laid for the study of individualist anarchism. Okay, so we're going to go back to here. This PDF is going to be available to everybody on my website, voluntaristacademy.com. As anyone looking at the screen can see, there's plenty of notes. All the references that were made in writing this chapter are referenced right here. There's like there's over 100. There's 117 references. So in case anybody's interested, head on over to voluntaristacademy.com. Again, this is from a book called Anarchy and the Law. It's an aggregation of various writers and thinkers and the anarchist ways, and it's quite a book to have in your own personal library. It really is. It's really phenomenal. So yeah, I mean that was that. That does it for tonight. Okay, so I want everybody to, I want to say thank you to everybody for sticking it out with me. I know like this one might have been a little bit on the boring side, but when we're learning about anarchism and what does this have to do? I mean, but the channel is not called Anarchist Academy. It's called Voluntarist Academy. Well, anarchism is a condition, like I was talking about last night. We're in a condition of slavery. Anarchism simply means without rulers. Okay? Like that's what the etymological definition of the word anarchy is: without rulers. And if we're in a condition of slavery, well, then wouldn't the condition of anarchism be a condition of freedom? So if anarchism and freedom are like synonyms, then anarchism is a condition. Okay, so we're talking about all of these different types of anarchism, and which one could be best? Well, voluntarism is the action that leads to a condition of anarchism. So that's kind of like what I wanted to communicate with you in my little send-off here. And so with that being said, I really appreciate you guys' time and everything. It's been a pleasure. I haven't been feeling well tonight, but I really wanted to get this one done. It was important to me, and I hope that people out there can really reflect on it and get something out of it. Of course, we have Brendan Daniel to play us out tonight, and I just want to let everybody know that I'm trying to, I don't know. I guess I just got to get out of here. I got nothing else to say other than check out AUTONOMY. You guys, you might hear me talking about it all the time. AUTONOMY is a really cool 12-week course hosted by Richard Grove of tragedyandhope.com, Peace Revolution podcast, among many other projects such as Grand Theft World. And he teaches people ethical sales in an attempt to help others become entrepreneurs and to really bolster the free market and make it something worthwhile and something that can stick around for a long time. You might be, thinking to yourself, well, that doesn't sound like it's for me, but it can help you with communication skills. It can help you with a whole ton of things. There's so much in the AUTONOMY course. I can't even begin to explain it. You just have to take a chance and try to get in there and see for yourself. You can click on a link that's in the show notes right now, and it's an affiliate link. So if you do enroll in the course by clicking on that link, you do help me. You support my channel and some of my projects. So it's a win-win. I also, like to tell people that you can support the show directly by going to voluntaristacademy.com and making a donation. And with that being said, you guys know you own yourself, period. Okay. No one owns you. You can't own anybody. And freedom is within our reach. Just have to grab it. Okay. I love you all, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side.